Do you hear me?
Yeah, I can hear you. And we are live. Just go. Yes, you are live. We are live.
Mm-hmm. Um, just so I can start, yes?
We are live.
Mm-hmm. Just wait a minute, please. Sorry me for some technical problems because I hear only myself. Um, if everybody see my slides, I can start.
Yes, we can see your slide. The slide is
Thank you. I will turn off the voice because I hear myself and it's get some problems to me. Dear colleagues, I'm glad to be here on the fourth clinical trial summit. And my topic is not a topic, not a presentation, but a real case of how we conducted clinical trials in these complicated times of coronavirus pandemic situation. For Russia, for Russian clinical trials, it was really complicated time, and we are still here because we have a lot of restrictions and second wave of pandemic and second wave of illnesses, unfortunately. Before I'll start my topic, let's remember how everything started in the world. At the December of 2019, all the world had an information about first cases of COVID-19 appeared. In our company, we didn't matter this information because everything in Russia was okay. And there was no restrictions, no illnesses, no pneumonias. In the beginning of January, there was a new strain of SARS-CoV-2 identified, but the industry of clinical trials, maybe I'm not correct, but I have colleagues from Europe and from United States, didn't matter any problems with conducting of clinical trials. At the middle of February, World Health Organization named the new disease COVID-19. And in the beginning of the March, the disease covered 6 states, and there was a pandemic declared in all our world. In Russia, we started to have some restrictions from the middle of the March, and to the date of 16th, 17th March, there were a lot of people who in St. Petersburg, that's my local city, and in Moscow were wearing some facial masks and using sanitary gels and trying to go to home office. So it was the first time we faced some problems when there was when it became really complicated to go to clinical sites for patients to continue conducting in clinical trials. And in the end of the March, in Russia, some quarantine actions were officially started from the government. What regulatory recommendations were? In the beginning of the March, first Federal Drug Agency made their guidelines how to conduct clinical trials in conditions of COVID pandemic. And then EMA made it guide for sponsors. Russian regulator Ministry of Health reacted only on 27th of March when they made our local guideline, and the main topic of all these guidelines were trying to avoid protocol deviations from protocol deviations. How to avoid protocol deviations? We decided to make a protocol amendment, and unfortunately, it's impossible to make to approve protocol amendment ASAP. So all sponsors who conduct clinical trials in Russia had to wait for 1 or 2 months when the amendments will be approved by Ministry of Health. But all this time, we had a big question: how to conduct clinical trials, how to participate with this situation. What Geopharm had in March? During the beginning of pandemic, we had more than 10 clinical trials in different phases. 5 active studies of third phase. There were studies from diabetes mellitus of first and second type to hospital studies of stroke and something like this, of different traumas and clinical studies on children with different diseases. We had 4 trials of phase 1 studies on the period of startup, and 3 studies of third phase in the period of closeout and database lock. So for all the studies, we had to have a direct access to clinical sites and on-site monitoring. Because on-site monitoring seems to us that if clinical research associate can came to clinical site and it's safe for him, it will be safe for patients to came in clinical sites. More than 6 clinical trials of third phase were in startup period or waiting for the approval of Ministry of Health. And it was more than 455 patients we enrolled who were in clinical trials in different studies. And there were patients from diabetes to stroke and other diseases. What strange measures in clinical trials in conducting we found? First of all, the biggest problem for us was transferring to the operating mode of an infection hospitals. So if I can explain it, we had clinical sites. These sites were located in governmental hospitals, and one day we understand that it's impossible to come to our clinical sites, impossible not only for clinical research associates or patients, it was impossible for principal investigators, for study coordinators, for all clinical staff to come into their site to take access to investigational product, for source documents, for different materials, for informed consent forms, and other materials of clinical trials. So how we can conduct clinical trials without investigational product? It was the first case we had to solve, how to implement an access for our clinical staff to the site, where were a lot of people with coronavirus infection. The second case was that principal investigators and sometimes other investigators, study nurses and other coordinators started to work with, in Russia we said it, in red zone, with people who are sick from coronavirus infection. Restrictions, there were restrictions on planned outpatient appointments for hospitalization, because in Russia we had restrictions for people under 65 who participate in clinical trials a lot with different diseases to not to come for planned visits to medical sites. And there were some governmental forces to look after these people, and there were stop for them to come out from their homes. So people can't go to on-site visits. By protocol amendments were in Ministry of Health, not approved, and it was a great question for how we can allow doctors come to patients' homes because some doctors sometimes communicate with people who can be latent with COVID-19, or who can be infected by COVID-19 but don't know about it. The other situation that all Russian sponsors and people who conduct clinical trials in Russia met is relocation of investigators to other hospitals. What it was, sometimes doctors have a part-time job and they work in their main place in governmental hospital, and for a part-time job in some private medical hospital working in clinical trials. So if investigator work with coronavirus patients on his main place of work, it was very unsafe for him to participate with patients of our trials who have low immune level. And the last we met is restriction on part-time job. After, in the middle of the May, there was a governmental restriction for part-time jobs for doctors, and if in March and in April there was impossible and unsafe for them, for these investigators to participate with our patients, in the middle of the May, there was a restriction for government, for people to work in different places. That was, on the one hand, a safe measure, and on the other hand, a big problem for conducting clinical trials. Having a helicopter view on this situation, our project team, our clinical team, decided to see the situation on different levels. First level was a company sponsor level, because sponsor has sponsor staff and project clinical team, and who consist of clinical team leads, project managers, clinical research associates, study coordinators, and other people who work in clinical trials and who can contact with sick people, who can contact with investigators on on-site monitoring visits, and who can be unsafe for patients through investigators. The next level is project level. Risks for all clinical trials we had on different phases, because we had more than 300 patients in the middle of the trial, and we had to save them in trial. Risks for clinical sites, because some clinical sites haven't got sanitary measures to continue clinical trials, and sometimes investigators were sick, and we should all remember that all investigators are people, and their physical and mental health can be not so strong to participate with all this pandemic. And what is more, the level of patient and the level of patient societies, and we had to solve a big rhetorical question: what is more ethical, to stop conducting clinical trials and let patients stay at home without big risk of contaminating of COVID-19, or continue giving patients new therapy and and cover unmet medical needs in near 3 or 5 years when we end clinical trials. After this, we broke some groups of risks. Of course, we had different risk mitigation plans when we planned our trials, but unfortunately, we can't prognose that there will be ability to conduct clinical trials in some fighting conditions, with a lot of restrictions, with a lot of people who are afraid of being contaminated. First of all, there were patients, and the biggest question was for us is how to save patients in our clinical trials. Some services that were on this conference and colleagues have a great speeches about air concerned, about different gadgets in clinical trials, about using some media and social networks. But unfortunately, in clinical trials with people of older ages, 65, 70 years old, it's very hard to use air concerned, to use different gadgets, because not all people can participate with them. So there was a question how to save our patients. Second question was how to save study teams. And what we understand first is that if there are no not a lot study team, if there are only principal investigator and one or two investigators, we should make a lot of backups and make our study teams in our trials wider. Risks from clinical sites, because sometimes when on department of clinical site there was a coronavirus patient, they sometimes close all site for 2 weeks quarantine. Ethical committees. Ethical committees are still a big problem of conducting clinical trials in Russia in pandemic, because some ethical committees, independent ethical committees, says that it's not ethical to participate with patients, that it's not ethical to send different investigational products and materials by other people to these patients. The participation with regulator, because when coronavirus pandemic starts, there were a lot of actions of conducting trials of coronavirus drugs. Now, during the March, we had three allows of Ministry of Health to conduct clinical trials of coronavirus drugs. And now in Russia, we have more than 35 clinical trials of coronavirus drugs. So a lot of investigators, a lot of clinical staff who have experience participating in clinical trials were participated in clinical trials of coronavirus and coronavirus drugs. The group of risk is sponsored because having a project team, if any of this person or from this project team became ill and were in contact with other, there was a risk that other people from this project team can be sick. And when the person is ill, he can't conduct any processes of clinical trial. Risks for investigational product, because some people who were in quarantine at home or around and didn't want to go out from their homes to a clinical site had to use more investigational product, and the sponsor had to make pool of investigational product, and our use of it rises to more than 40%. Risks for materials, risk for vendors, and during one of our trials in the middle of July, we understand that our analytical laboratory, all staff are on quarantine because they all are ill, so there was a big risk for our timelines and time targets. And risk for laboratory, because when in Russia we understand there is a lot of people who can be contacted with coronavirus. All central labs and all labs who have PCR reactions started to make a test for coronavirus. So laboratory staff was used in coronavirus tests, and they haven't got any time and any forces to do our analysis and participate in clinical trials. What we did managing this situation? First of all, we bought personal protective equipment for investigators and patients, and make an amendment to informed consent form that says that if patients of clinical trials can come to clinical sites, they must use personal protective equipment. They must use sanitizers, and they must think about their safety. Second was allowing of taxi, not only to visit clinical site for patient, but to visit clinical site for investigators and for clinical staff, for coordinators and for clinical nurses. And what is more, we ask clinical staff to stop going to social places where a lot of people they can meet to save our patients and save themselves. The second tip we created is delivery of investigational products and materials to the patient home. It was a big problem for us because we should find a vendor who can make the delivery without any contact with patients who were sick from coronavirus. We created protocol amendments. We started study visits at home. We started a remote monitoring, but I can say that it was a great experience of remote monitoring, because when you start to use remote monitoring in your project, you should be sure that the information you see on blinded copies of the source documents will be in real source documents. And now, when the lockdown is closed and from the end of the summer we can be back to our on-site visits, sometimes we see some corrections with real source data and blinded copies we took for remote monitoring. What is more, there was an idea of relocation of subject to other sites, and great ethical support, because when the protocol amendment is not approved by Ministry of Health, sometimes you can use the help of ethical committees just to see an independent view of your protocol. If everything is safe, will be safe and ethical for subjects. What interesting cases we met during coronavirus pandemic? First interesting case was about investigators' refusal to relocate patients to other site without risk of coronavirus patients. I'll explain what I mean. We had a situation when clinical site enrolled for 40 patients, and after the end of enrollment, they were requalified to infectional clinic and started to take people who sick from coronavirus pneumonia. So it was really unsafe for patients to continue coming to the site and continue participating with investigators who work with coronavirus patients. But the principal investigator was with strong refusal to relocate his patients. The other one case was governmental closing the city exit, because sometimes we enroll people to our clinical trials who live in the countryside, and for more than a month it was impossible to come from the countryside to the city center in different regions of Russia. Closing clinical site for quarantine and impossibility for investigators to get investigational product and source documents. As I said in the beginning of my speech, it was really a really hard question how to solve it, because all administration of hospitals were on home-based, and sometimes in hospitals there were only one person who was able to open the door. Closing the region for air and after communication with Moscow. The biggest communication pool in Russia is the capital of Russia, Moscow, and the biggest airports and logical pools relocates in Moscow. So when Moscow closed air communication with regions, with other cities of Russia, it starts to be impossible to send investigational product, different materials, and other things. And the last interesting case was illness of ethical committees. So sometimes all members of ethical committees were sitting at home in bad conditions, in bad health, and it was impossible to approve new amendments and new measures of helping people, of helping patients. And now all clinical trial industry in Russia, and it seems that all clinical trial industry all over the world have different questions like what to do next, how to continue active clinical trials, how to start new clinical trials. Only our company have to start more than 10 projects now, and from first to fourth stages. And sometimes we have really great questions how we can hospitalize people. Should we do coronavirus test before hospitalization and something like this? What new standards of conducting clinical trials will be, and if there will be some good clinical practice transformation, maybe R3 reduction or something like this. How will be clinical monitoring transform, and how will be criteria of quality control transform in new conditions? Because more than 6 months it was impossible to make some audits, to make some inspections and independent audits, because auditors were not safe and they don't want to work and to visit clinical sites. In our experience, it's impossible to see informed consent form without visiting site. And how transformation of all participants, and it's sure that the transformation should be for all participants of trials, for sponsors, for sites, for patients, for regulators, and for ethics. But first of all, we should think about safety and of our patients and ethical aspects of enrollment of patients. If you have any questions, I will be glad to answer. Thank you for your attention. Hello.
Hello. Thank you so much, Tatiana, for the valuable presentation. The content that you have shared with us, it's highly
Yes,
interesting.
of course. I'll send the presentation to every member.
Thank you so much for your presentation, and we will be just going live with our next presentation. You can ask questions which you need to ask from Tatiana, and within few minutes we will be going live for our next presentation of Denise Tickle, who is working as a head of clinical collaborations in Gentech. Thank you so much. Thank you.